The grid is a tool used within art to help the artist compose his or her contour drawing. It can be used as a visual structure to organize color, composition, and design. This simple tool has helped guide the novice artist to the master for thousands of years. So in this video, we will discuss the grid's use in art history, and I'll show you how to set up a simple one. If you'd like to skip ahead, timestamps are in the video description. While visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art a few years ago, I came across a piece in the Egyptian art section. On a chip of limestone called an ostrakhan, an unknown artist depicts a man wearing a wig. According to the Met, this work is of Senenmut, the ancient Egyptian architect and government official of the 18th dynasty. Here we get a behind-the-scenes look of ancient Egyptian art. Clearly seen in this piece is the use of a grid to help the artist maintain the proportions of a side-profile portrait in ink. This piece is dated between 1479 and 1458 BC. If we skip forward through the art history timeline to the early 16th century, we come across the German painter and printmaker Albrecht Dürer. As one of the prominent figures of the Northern Renaissance, Dürer was an early advocate of perspective and proportion. In this 1525 woodcut titled Draftsman Drawing a Recumbent Woman, Dürer shows us the use of his drawing machine. This tool utilizes a grid which is used to draw from life rather than from a print or a copy. The drawing machine is made of a square wooden frame with stretched horizontal and vertical threads at regular intervals. This forms a grid. The artist lines his eye with the rod to keep his vision fixed in the same position. While looking through this gridded window or veil, he copies what he sees onto his gridded paper below. This invention was most likely influenced by the work of Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti's 1435's De Pictura, meaning on painting, shows the use of a grid in perspective. De Pictura was highly influential to Quattrocento artists, many of which look through grids while studying perspective. The Latin roots of the word perspective even translate to looking or observing through. In the year 1675, English author William Salmon documented the use of a grid for keeping proportions. This document offers step-by-step instructions on how to draw with a drawing machine. If we take a look at Sassoferrato's gorgeous 1670s painting, The Holy Family with the infant St. John the Baptist, we see a masterfully rendered multi-figure composition. Another work found at the Met is his preparatory drawing by Sassoferrato, which displays the grid he used for his composition. This was most likely used to transfer the work onto copper. One of my favorite paintings of all time is Jacques-Louis David's neoclassical masterpiece, The Death of Socrates, which is also located at the Met in New York. This 1787 oil on canvas was composed using the grid as a guiding tool for accurate proportions and scaled perspective. Moving forward to the Impressionists of the mid-19th century, Edgar Degas is widely recognized for his genre scenes and paintings of dancers. Although associated with the plein air tradition of painting, most of Degas' works were compiled inside the studio. Grids, of course, were used. There are many more, but the last artist I'd like to talk about is Vincent van Gogh. Vincent wrote many letters during his lifetime, the majority of which were to his brother Theo. These letters give us admirers great insight into the mind of the artist and are highly recommended to browse through. But on page 433 of Volume 1, Vincent writes to his brother about his gridded perspective frame. Quoting the letter, "I will begin with little things, but this summer I hope to practice making large sketches in charcoal, so I can paint them later on a somewhat larger scale, and therefore I ordered a new and I hope better perspective frame, which can be fixed in uneven ground in the dunes by two poles, in this way, for instance, see drawing." End quote. Here Vincent illustrates a man looking through the perspective frame at a seascape. Using triangles rather than square grids, the artist can replicate what he sees onto his paper. This device is very similar to the Dürer frame that we talked about earlier. Quoting another section, "So on the shore or in the meadows or in the fields, one can look through it like a window. The vertical lines and the horizontal line of the frame, and the diagonal lines and the intersection, or else the division in squares, certainly gives a few fundamental pointers which help one make a solid drawing and which indicate the main lines and proportions. at least for those who have some instinct for perspective and some understanding of why and how the perspective causes an apparent change of direction in the lines and change of size in planes and in the whole mass. Without this, the instrument is of little or no use, and looking through it makes one dizzy." End quote. So now that we have a basic understanding of the grid and its use in art history, let's make a simple one using a few tools. First, we're going to need our reference photo. I want to make this as easy as possible, so I chose an image of a lotus flower. Unlike portraits or figures, drawing a flower is very forgiving and great for learning the fundamentals. We're also going to need a ruler and pencils. For this, any pencil will do, but I'm using an HB and a 6H. For the first step, make sure your ruler is parallel to a side of the paper and decide on a grid size that works for you. You can use centimeters or half inches for detailed work, but here I'm using inches, so I make a mark at every 1 inch. For an 8.5 by 11 size sheet paper, I find 1 inch grids works very well. Do the exact same thing on the right side of the paper. The rest of this is pretty straightforward, but it's a good thing to remeasure your lines to make sure everything's correct. But then all you do is take your ruler and connect each one. For this simple grid, we're going to make sure we have everything square. So what we want to do on the top here is the exact same thing on the sides, mark off lines every 1 inch. You can get more advanced with grids by making rectangles or different triangles like the Vincent van Gogh style grid, but for now let's keep this nice and simple and just use squares across the whole thing. So just like before, take your ruler and connect all the lines. Now on our blank piece of drawing paper, we want to do the exact same thing by setting up 1 inch grids across the whole thing. But this time, instead of using an HB pencil, I'm using a much lighter one. Here I'm using a 6H. You could use any pencil you want, but what I like to do is I like to make the lines very light, so I use a hard pencil. That way at the end, I'm able to erase them. Now this is subjective or personal preference, but if you use a lighter pencil, it's a lot easier to erase the lines out at the end or blend them in while you're drawing itself. Some artists like to keep the lines to show their work before. That's really up to you. For me, I like them light so that I could remove them when the drawing is complete. Here I'm labeling the columns A through I, and I'm numbering the rows 1 through 12. On a smaller drawing like this isn't really necessary, but if you're working on something large with a lot of rows and a lot of columns, this can be very helpful. Just like before, I want to keep my references on my drawing paper very light, so here I'm using a 6H. For the drawing itself, this part is called the contour drawing. What the contour means is the outline. So what we need to do in drawing is learn to focus our attention on one small section. This is a relatively easy drawing, but if I look at the entire shape and all the petals, I'm going to get overwhelmed very quickly and start giving up or start rushing, and the shapes aren't going to come out right. So here I'm just working on a few grids, trying to replicate what I see in my reference over to my drawing page. Now, if you come to a part in your drawing where you feel like your grid is too large and you can't see enough detail in it, what you can do here is draw an X right in the middle of it and then do the exact same thing on your reference page. This is going to give you more information to work with in your grid. So in each square grid, you're going to have 4 small triangles. The nice thing about this is that you can have smaller grids where you need them rather than redrawing an entire grid. This may not be needed on a drawing like this, but if you're working on something more detailed like a portrait and come to an area that has a lot of detail, let's say like the mouth or the teeth, it's very useful to put this in. I've used it many times and it helped me get my drawing more correct. Now I wish I could tell you that there was some secret or some trick to have your contour drawing laid in accurately, but there isn't. What happens when using the grid is that it's going to improve your hand-eye coordination and you'll get much quicker at this in time, and you'll start to be able to draw from life a lot easier. And even if you become highly skilled in freehand drawing, it's nice to go back to the grid when you work on more complicated pieces. Let's say a multi-figure composition where you're going to be adding a lot of detail of shading and values in. The last thing that you want to happen is to get halfway through a drawing, adding in the values, and realize that something is slightly off. So the grid's nice just to have that bit of reassurance. If you'd like, you can also set up your grid on a computer with a program like Photoshop or on your phone. There's plenty of apps that allow this. But if possible, I recommend printing out your reference and drawing the grid this way. You can use a monitor or a phone to look at your reference. The only problem with that is you're looking at emitted light rather than reflected light. The nice thing about a printed page is that the contrast or values will never change. If you're looking at a monitor or a phone, judging on the brightness or the angle you're looking at it, it could shift or change a little bit. So if you use a printed page, I find that it makes the drawing process a little bit simpler. So if you can, I recommend it. Once I finish my contour drawing, I come in with a kneaded eraser and lighten all the lines. This way, when I actually do the blending and the shading, the reference lines that I use to draw my contours are less pronounced and kind of hidden away in the background. Now, another great option for the grid is to scale up your drawings to larger pieces. So here I have a blank canvas, which is about double, almost triple the size of this piece of paper, and I'm going to use an enlarged grid to transfer this drawing over. So we're going to have to use some basic math to scale this up. From A through I have 9 squares. So all I have to do is remember that number and then measure the length of my canvas. Here I have about 16.2. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide 16.2 by 9. So I get an answer of 1.8, which I'm going to use as a reference for my grid size. So a lot of times you'll get long fractions. So what you want to do is round to the nearest tenth. So let's say it's 1.777, just round it up to 1.8. Before I draw my grid, I set up a template because sometimes the fractions can get complicated adding down and it's easy to make mistakes. So what I do on a blank piece of paper is I put a mark every 1.8 inches and then I use that to draw my actual grid on the canvas itself. Once I have this complete, I remeasure to make sure everything is correct, and then I use this template as a guide on my canvas itself to mark off lines. This way I know that every single mark is 1.8 inches. Once I'm finished with that, just like before, I use a ruler to connect all the lines, and that's it. We have a scaled up grid. The nice thing about a grid that's scaled up like this is drawing it is exactly the same as drawing a smaller one. I'm using my reference and I'm just copying each grid square one by one, getting my contours and outlines in the correct places. While you're working with grids too, you can adjust them to any size you need to work on specific parts of drawings or to move one section from an initial drawing onto a canvas. Just kind of play around with it and see what works best for you. I was going to finish the video here, but I was thinking more about the Dura grid, and I thought it would be interesting to see what one looks like, because I've never really seen one in person, so I decided here to build one. So using a miter saw, I cut 4 pieces of pine 16 inches in length, and I also cut 2 6-inch pieces to use as a base. To join the pieces together, I just used some wood glue and an 18 gauge brad nailer. Just to make sure these pieces were lined up, I used a speed square. If you're ever using a brad nailer, don't do what I did here. Your fingers should always be clear from the path of the nail. Sometimes the brad nail could shoot out in a strange direction, so your fingers and hands should always be behind it. I was trying to get a good camera angle here, so this was pretty stupid. Either way, I got this complete, and the best thing to do at the end to make sure it's square is use a ruler or a tape measure like I'm doing here, and just measure both diagonals, make sure they're the same. So I can see on the first one, it's about 22 3/4, and it's the exact same thing on the other diagonal, so I know it's square. To set up a grid, I used a ruler just like we did before. I marked off a line every 1 inch, and instead of drawing, I used a drill to drill in a small pilot hole, and then I used my impact driver to drive in screws across every hole. After all the screws were placed in the right spot, I used those 2 6-inch pieces of wood that I cut out before, and with some glue and some brad nails, I put them in the bottom so we have a base so that this grid could stand up. This is finished right now. The next thing we have to do is string it up. This last part's simple and pretty straightforward. All you want to do is take some string and tie it tight between each of the screws so you have a straight line. Make sure that the string doesn't have any slack or give to it so each line is straight like it was drawn with a ruler. And that's complete. That's a Durer or Alberti grid. Now with the legs, you could stand this up and set up any scene you want to try drawing with. Here I set up a very simple still life with a white background. So one thing I learned while I was using this is that it works best if you close one eye. If you're looking with two eyes, which is binocular vision, you're seeing it from two different angles because your eyes are spaced apart. So if you close one eye, I notice it's a little bit simpler to try to draw. You could do it with both eyes, but it's just something I noticed. Now, I don't know if I'd ever use this for making actual art, but it's cool to see. It's fun to try out. In the future, I may make a longer video actually using one of these to work on something more complicated, maybe a portrait where we have a model sit in, or a more complicated still life, but this will work. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one and maybe learned something, and I'll see you next time.